The new Tomb Raider design is causing outrage. Lara Croft has survived dinosaurs, mercenaries, ancient gods, and the PlayStation 1's original boob physics engine, but in 2025 she has to survive another round of culture war theatrics because somehow the reveal of Lara's latest character design has managed to annoy people. As you see, Lara can't just exist as a character anymore, she has to symbolise something, represent something, or fail some invisible purity test dreamed up on social media. So in this video, I want to slow the whole thing down and talk about what actually changed in Lara's design. Why are some people angry? And, more importantly, what does this endless outrage cycle tell us about the way modern games are discussed and marketed in the first place? I am Lady Decade, and if you like your games industry coverage spicy, then hit subscribe. Let's talk about the latest controversy surrounding Tomb Raider. As a child, I grew up with the original Tomb Raider at a time when games didn't feel like they were constantly trying to explain themselves, and Lara Croft felt genuinely different to anything else on the screen. As a young girl, I didn't see her as a political statement or a marketing exercise. I saw a capable, confident woman who was allowed to be adventurous, competent, and a little bit aloof, without the game ever stopping to justify her existence. She wasn't asking for permission, she wasn't performing relatability, and she wasn't apologising for taking up space. What mattered to me was that she was beautiful and cool. Now, what's even cooler is that you can relive her most glorious days by picking up the original Tomb Raider trilogy remastered with modern graphics with a shocking 87% off the usual price, meaning that all 3 entries can be yours for less than $5 in total. In fact, if you use my links below, you can get up to 90% off of thousands of games from Expedition 33 to Stellar Blade and so many more. So happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. The scale of the reaction to Lara Croft's depiction in the latest Tomb Raider game didn't match what had been shown. Not disappointment, not mild skepticism, but in some cases outright panic, moral urgency, and strangely emotional outrage. Some people weren't just saying they didn't like the design, they were insisting it was dangerous, regressive, politically loaded, or symptomatic of some broader cultural rot that apparently needed addressing immediately. The reaction didn't feel connected to the trailer I had just watched, as though 2 entirely different objects were being discussed. Let me rewind here because the order matters, and the way you experience things in real time often tell you far more than the think pieces that follow. When I first saw Lara in the trailer, the very first thing that I noticed was her outfit. Straight away, it was instantly recognisable. It looked like Lara Croft. Practical, iconic, familiar without being cartoonish, and crucially, not trying to reinvent itself as a statement. A silhouette that made sense, that felt grounded in the character's history without being trapped by it. And then I noticed her face. Calm, confident, feminine, composed, not uncanny or grotesque or digitally smoothed into something plastic and unreal, just Lara. Someone who looks capable, and she's self-possessed and very clearly comfortable occupying the space that she's in, very much like Lara of old. She didn't feel like she was asking permission to exist or trying to preempt any criticism. She was simply presented with a character who looked assured in herself. And then she moved. The fluidity, the cat-like motion, the gymnast's confidence that's been missing for years, the absence of hesitation, of self-doubt, of that constant trauma-coded stiffness that's become so common in modern reboots where characters often feel permanently burdened by their own narratives. She moved like Lara Croft used to move. Decisive, agile, instinctive, and at home in danger rather than overwhelmed by it. And that was the moment that I relaxed. Not because I suddenly thought the game would be perfect or because I was overcome with nostalgia, but because something fundamental had clicked into place. There was a sense of familiarity that went deeper than visuals or references. What the game looked like was a Tomb Raider game. One detail that often gets lost in the nostalgia is that Tomb Raider wasn't originally conceived as a PlayStation game at all, but as a Sega Saturn title. It's something that people don't realise because of how closely the franchise later became associated with Sony, despite core design beginning development with the Saturn in mind and even launching the game there first in Europe. And speaking of the Saturn, I recently explored it in depth on my retro hardware channel, Lady Arcade, where I've been revisiting cult systems from the Saturn itself to the 3DO to the Vectrix and most recently the Sega Master System. So check out my other channel after watching this video. Crystal Dynamics, to their credit, didn't accompany their reveal with a long speech about what they were trying to say or who they were trying to please. What they showed was fairly restrained, almost deliberately so. A visible tonal shift away from the relentless self-interrogation and towards something more confident, more playful and more recognisable. That restraint mattered because for a long time now, game reveals have felt less like invitations and more like explanations. Studios have developed a habit of over-justifying themselves as though they no longer trust the audience to engage with the work on its own terms. Trailers arrive preloaded with context, disclaimers and moral framing as if the product itself can't be allowed to speak first. This didn't feel like nostalgia bait, but it did feel like a studio testing whether it could trust its audience, again without announcing that fact in a press release or spelling out the lesson it hoped everyone would take from it. And yet, almost immediately, the loudest backlash arrived from a very specific direction.
I'd like to make a complaint, please.
The complaints came thick and fast. She's too pretty. She looks like a supermodel. She feels regressive. She looks AI generated. And what's striking about these objections is not that they're overstated, but that they aren't really about the game at all. None of this criticism engages with gameplay, mechanics, animation quality, or even tone in any meaningful way. Amongst radicals, attractiveness itself has become suspect. Somewhere along the line, beauty stopped being a neutral trait and started being treated as an ideological signal. A female character looking confident, feminine and unashamed of it is no longer allowed to simply exist within a piece of entertainment. It has to be interrogated, problematized and framed as morally questionable, as though her presence alone requires justification. And that's why so much of this backlash feels oddly personal. It doesn't read like concern for Lara Croft as a character or even for the franchise as a whole. It reads like people projecting their own insecurities onto a video game and then treating that projection as critique. When someone dislikes a design choice but frames it as dangerous or regressive rather than simply saying, "This isn't for me," something else is happening. Discomfort that could be acknowledged privately is instead being externalized and moralized. It has to be the game's fault or the audience's moral failing, because admitting "this makes me uncomfortable" no longer feels socially acceptable in certain spaces, particularly when discomfort has been reframed as evidence of ideological virtue rather than personal taste. Aesthetic discomfort is inflated into moral urgency because that is the only framework left that still carries authority in these conversations. Framing something as personally unpleasant no longer seems to carry weight, but framing it as socially or politically threatening still does. And when you see that same pattern repeated across multiple franchises, multiple studios and multiple years, it becomes very difficult to pretend this is about design principles or artistic critique. What you're watching instead is psychological displacement playing out in public, with a fictional character standing in as the target. Certain people hate the new Lara Croft because she, get this, wears makeup. You know, the Mascara discourse is where all of this really gives itself away. Eyelashes, makeup realism, arguments about whether an explorer would bother to look put together while scrambling through ruins. These aren't marginal side conversations either. They're often presented as decisive critiques, as though the entire legitimacy of the design hinges on whether Lara Croft should have time for mascara between outrunning traps and looting ancient tombs. This is a franchise about mythic artifacts, lost civilizations, ancient magic, and dinosaurs. It has always operated in the realm of heightened fantasy and pulp adventure. Realism has never been the governing principle, nor has it ever pretended to be. Lara Croft has survived falls that would pulverise a human spine, solved ancient puzzles in seconds, and routinely encountered creatures that should not exist outside of folklore. So when criticism drills down to this level of granular nitpicking, it stops reading as serious engagement with the work and starts reading as people desperately searching for something technical they can point to, because the real objection can't be comfortably stated out loud. It's an attempt to dress up aesthetic discomfort as analytical rigour, to give a personal reaction the authority of critique. And audiences can sense that instinctively. They recognise when an argument is being reverse engineered, when someone has reached a conclusion first and is now rummaging around for reasons to support it after the fact. That's why this kind of discourse rarely persuades anyone outside of the bubble it originates in. What's driving the intensity now, though, isn't just discomfort, it's timing. For the better part of a decade, certain aesthetic and ideological preferences were treated as settled within the industry. Characters were flattened preemptively, femininity was softened or restrained, and visual confidence was often reframed as something that needed justification or mitigation. These decisions weren't always malicious and they weren't always imposed from above, but they were heavily reinforced by press approval, consultancy advice, and the assumption that anyone who objected simply didn't get it or was on the wrong side of history. Well, newsflash, activist, gaming press, that insulation is failing. The pendulum really is starting to swing back the other way, not because of some grand political conspiracy, but because the market has been delivering very clear, very expensive feedback. When influence begins to slip, reactions don't get calmer, they get louder. People who were accustomed to shaping the conversation, setting the tone and policing the boundaries suddenly find that studios are no longer bending over backwards to accommodate them, and that loss of leverage produces panic. It's why the outrage feels sharper now than it did 5 or 10 years ago. To be clear, not every negative reaction fits the pattern. There are, as there have always been, fans on the other side who wish Lara was more exaggerated, more overtly sexualized, more closely aligned with their personal nostalgia, and that criticism exists. And it isn't particularly deep or interesting, but it's also not especially complicated. There is an important difference in scale and framing that's worth acknowledging honestly. Wanting Lara to be even hotter is shallow, but it's also straightforward, largely unserious, and not framed as a moral emergency. It's simply a preference, and stated as such. Pretending these two reactions are equivalent does more to obscure what's actually happening than to clarify it. Because the real story here isn't even Lara Croft at all. It's about power. For a long time now, large publishers have been more than comfortable telling gamers what they should want than listening to what they actually respond to. Decisions were increasingly shaped by investor expectations, corporate risk management culture, and the advice of consultancies whose job was to minimise controversy rather than maximise enjoyment. ESG considerations, DEI frameworks, and reputational signalling didn't dictate individual character designs in any mechanical sense, but they did help shape studio incentives, priorities, and internal structure, and over time they became a substitute for genuine audience engagement. Those decisions were then insulated with more moral language and favourable press coverage, smoothing over rejection and reframing criticism as misunderstanding. For a while that strategy worked, largely because the financial consequences were delayed and the disconnect between approval and sales wasn't immediately visible. A game could underperform and still be defended as important, necessary, or forward-thinking, with the hope that the numbers would catch up eventually. That is clearly no longer the case. We've now seen several high-profile releases in a row where the messaging was immaculate, the coverage was favourable, and the sales still collapsed. Enormous budgets were spent on games that were technically competent, socially approved, and commercially rejected. At that point, the lesson becomes difficult to ignore. You cannot lecture your way to success. You cannot tell players what they should enjoy and expect them to comply, no matter how polished the justification sounds. Gamers don't need to win arguments anymore. They don't need to convince journalists or activists or consultancy firms that their preferences are valid. They don't need to engage in endless online debates or justify themselves against accusations of bad taste, bad politics or bad morals. They just need to not buy the game. Money cuts through narrative far more efficiently than outrage ever could, and it does so lovely and quietly. And that reality is now forcing a recalibration that no amount of social media noise can stop. Studios can dismiss angry comment threads, they can ride out bad press, they can even survive a few days of online backlash. But what they can't survive is indifference. And they certainly cannot survive repeated indifference at scale. Balance sheets are brutally honest in a way discourse never is. And this is why Lara matters here, not as a culture or trophy, not as a symbol to be claimed or defended, but as a signal. Crystal Dynamics didn't make a speech. They didn't announce a return to tradition or declare independence from anything. They didn't posture, grandstand or preemptively apologise. They trusted movement, confidence and recognisable identity. They trusted that players might actually want to play a Tomb Raider game that looks like a Tomb Raider game again. Most people saw that immediately. Most coverage has been positive. Most players are relieved rather than outraged, because most players aren't looking for a moral puzzle when they sit down to play a video game. They're looking for something that feels good to control, fun to explore, and confident in its own identity. When a character design enrages activists for being too attractive and mildly annoys purists for not being exaggerated enough, it usually means the studio has stopped lecturing and started listening, not to the loudest voices, not to the most agitated commentators, but to the people who actually buy the games, play them, and keep the industry alive in the first place. Don't forget you can pick up the original Tomb Raider trilogy remastered with modern graphics with a shocking 87% off the usual price, meaning all 3 entries can be yours for less than $5 total. In fact, you can use my link below to get up to 90% off of thousands of games from Expedition 33 to Stellar Blade and so many more. There are thousands of deals to be had, and each one supports my channel. Or if you want to support what I do in other ways, you might want to check out my new retro gaming channel, Lady Arcade, or by accessing my cosplay library by becoming a backer over on Patreon. I'll see you all again soon.